What if one of the most powerful empires in history lost an entire continent? Not because it was weaker, but because ordinary people slowly stopped believing they belonged to it. So, before you settle in for tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy exploring history together. If you're listening from somewhere around the world tonight, leave your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where history brings us together. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us travel back more than 2.5 centuries to a world where no one imagined that a new nation called the United States would soon exist. The story begins long before the first musket fired at Lexington. In the early 1760s, 13 British colonies stretched along the eastern coast of North America. Together they were home to roughly 1.5 million people, yet they were anything but united. New England was a land of fishermen, shipbuilders, merchants, and deeply religious Puritan communities. Town meetings shaped local government, education was highly valued, and villages were closely connected through churches and family life. Farther south, the Middle Colonies presented a completely different picture. New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey bustled with merchants from England, Germany, the Netherlands, Scotland, and many other places. Different languages echoed through crowded marketplaces, while religious diversity became part of everyday life. The southern colonies formed another world entirely. Great plantations covered the countryside, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. Wealthy landowners lived in elegant estates inspired by English country homes, while thousands of enslaved Africans performed the exhausting labor that fueled the colonial economy. Each colony looked different. Each colony governed itself differently. Each colony believed its own interests mattered most. Very few people thought of themselves as Americans. Instead, they proudly called themselves Virginians, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, or Carolinians. Above everything else, they considered themselves loyal British subjects. Across the Atlantic, Britain stood as the greatest naval power on Earth. Its ships protected colonial trade. Its soldiers defended distant frontiers. British law governed everyday life. British fashions filled colonial streets, and British newspapers shaped public opinion. To many colonists, belonging to the British Empire felt less like a burden and more like a privilege. Life in the colonies was remarkably prosperous. Land was abundant. Food was relatively inexpensive. Taxes remained far lower than those paid by families living in Britain itself. For many ordinary colonists, opportunities seemed limitless. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, quiet tensions had already begun to grow. Only a few years earlier, another great struggle had transformed North America forever. The French and Indian War had drawn Britain and France into a fierce contest for control of the continent. For nearly a decade, soldiers marched through forests, forts changed hands, and native nations found themselves caught between two competing empires. When the fighting finally ended in 1763, Britain emerged victorious. France surrendered vast territories stretching across North America. The British Empire had never appeared stronger. But victory carried an enormous cost. The war left Britain burdened with staggering debts that threatened the kingdom's finances. Members of Parliament looked across the Atlantic toward their prosperous colonies and reached what seemed to them an obvious conclusion. If British soldiers defended America, then American colonists should help pay for that protection. Few people realized it then, but this simple financial decision would begin a chain of events that neither Britain nor its colonies could ever fully control. Over the coming years, arguments over taxes would slowly evolve into arguments over rights. Arguments over rights would become demands for self-government. And demands for self-government would eventually lead to open revolution. History often remembers wars for their great battles. Yet revolutions usually begin much more quietly. Not with cannon fire, but with conversations, with disagreements, with ordinary people asking questions that powerful governments can no longer answer. The first cracks in Britain's relationship with its American colonies did not appear on a battlefield. They appeared on pieces of paper. Following the enormous expense of the French and Indian War, the British government searched desperately for reliable sources of revenue. Maintaining thousands of soldiers across North America required money, and Parliament believed the colonies should contribute more directly to the cost of their own defense. For officials in London, the reasoning seemed perfectly sensible. For many colonists, it felt like something entirely different. In 1764, Parliament introduced the Sugar Act, lowering taxes on imported molasses while increasing enforcement against smuggling. British customs officers received greater authority to inspect ships and seize cargo, while merchants accused of violating trade laws could face trial in admiralty courts without a traditional jury. Many colonial merchants saw the measure not simply as a tax, but as a dangerous expansion of British control. The following year, Parliament went even further. In March of 1765, lawmakers passed the Stamp Act. Unlike previous trade duties, this tax reached deeply into everyday colonial life. Legal documents, newspapers, marriage licenses, playing cards, books, business contracts, even ordinary pamphlets. Almost every printed item now required an official stamp purchased from the British government. For the first time, Parliament had imposed a direct internal tax on the colonies without consulting their elected assemblies. Across the Atlantic, few members of Parliament expected serious resistance. After all, taxes in Britain remained far higher than anything Americans were being asked to pay. But they misunderstood something far more important than money. The issue was never only the amount. It was who possessed the right to impose it. Throughout the colonies, political leaders argued that taxes could only be approved by representatives chosen by the people themselves. Since the American colonies elected no representatives to Parliament, many insisted that Parliament possessed no constitutional authority to tax them directly. A simple phrase soon spread from colony to colony. No taxation without representation. Those 5 words captured an idea powerful enough to unite people who had previously shared little beyond geography. Printers repeated the slogan in newspapers. Lawyers debated it in crowded taverns. Farmers discussed it after Sunday church services. Merchants repeated it across busy docks. For the first time, colonists in distant provinces found themselves arguing for a common political principle. Resistance soon moved beyond words. In Boston, groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty emerged under leaders such as Samuel Adams. Meeting after dark, they organized public demonstrations, distributed pamphlets, and encouraged ordinary citizens to oppose British officials responsible for enforcing the new tax. Stamp distributors quickly became targets of public anger. Crowds gathered outside their homes. Effigies were hung from towering elm trees. Some officials resigned before the law even took effect, fearing for their safety. Violence remained limited compared to what would come later, but the message was unmistakable. Many colonists would no longer quietly accept decisions made 3,000 miles away. Merchants joined the movement through economic pressure. Instead of purchasing British manufactured goods, they signed non-importation agreements. Stores refused new shipments. Consumers deliberately avoided British products. Artisans encouraged neighbors to buy locally made alternatives. Homespun cloth became more than practical clothing. It became a symbol of resistance. Women played an essential role during these boycotts. Across towns and villages, they gathered to weave homespun fabric, organize community spinning events, and reduce dependence on imported British textiles. Though often absent from official political meetings, their everyday choices strengthened the growing protest movement. In October 1765, representatives from 9 colonies gathered in New York for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. It was one of the first occasions in which separate colonies formally met to coordinate a united political response. Delegates drafted petitions declaring their loyalty to King George III while firmly rejecting Parliament's authority to impose internal taxes without colonial consent. They did not seek independence. Not yet. Most still believed reconciliation remained entirely possible. They simply wanted the traditional rights they believed every British subject deserved. Back in London, British merchants soon noticed something alarming. Orders from America had fallen sharply. Warehouses filled with unsold goods. Manufacturers began pressuring Parliament to reconsider the tax. Economic losses accomplished what political arguments alone could not. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Celebrations erupted throughout the colonies. Church bells rang. Bonfires illuminated town squares. Many believed the crisis had finally ended. Yet hidden within Parliament's decision lay another law that attracted far less attention. On the very same day the Stamp Act disappeared, lawmakers approved the Declaratory Act. Its wording appeared brief. Its consequences would prove enormous. Parliament declared that it possessed the full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The immediate dispute had ended, but the larger constitutional question remained completely unresolved. Britain believed its authority had been reaffirmed. Many colonists believed their resistance had forced Parliament to retreat. Both sides walked away convinced they had defended their principles. Neither realized that compromise had become increasingly difficult. The arguments had grown larger than taxes. They had become arguments over sovereignty itself. And once people begin asking who truly holds the right to govern, history rarely returns to the way it was before. The repeal of the Stamp Act brought relief across the colonies. For a brief moment, many people believed the crisis had passed. Merchants reopened trade. Ships once again filled colonial harbors. Families returned to their ordinary routines. But beneath the surface, neither Britain nor the colonies had changed their beliefs. Parliament still believed it possessed absolute authority. The colonists still believed that authority had limits. The next confrontation was only a matter of time. In 1767, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, introduced a new series of taxes. Unlike the Stamp Act, these duties applied to imported goods rather than documents. Glass, lead, paint, paper.
There.
On paper, the taxes appeared modest. Yet the principle behind them remained exactly the same. Colonists saw another attempt by Parliament to raise revenue without the consent of their elected assemblies. British officials hoped these new taxes would be accepted more quietly. Instead, resistance spread even faster than before. Newspapers criticized Parliament almost daily. Political pamphlets circulated from colony to colony. Town meetings became increasingly crowded as ordinary citizens debated the future of British America. Once again, merchants organized non-importation agreements. British textiles disappeared from many shops. Imported luxury goods became symbols of submission. Local craftsmen found new customers. Blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, and printers all benefited as colonists attempted to rely more on products made at home. Women again stood at the center of this quiet revolution. Across New England, spinning bees became community events where dozens gathered to produce homespun cloth. These gatherings were practical, but they also carried political meaning. Every piece of locally woven fabric represented one less purchase from Britain. No muskets were fired. Yet thousands of ordinary families were participating in organized resistance. The city of Boston soon became the heart of colonial opposition. Its narrow streets echoed with public speeches, its taverns filled with political debate. Its newspapers criticized royal officials with increasing confidence. British leaders viewed Boston as dangerously rebellious. In response, they decided to demonstrate imperial authority. In 1768, nearly 4,000 British soldiers arrived to occupy the city. For Boston's population of roughly 16,000 people, the military presence was impossible to ignore. Red-coated soldiers patrolled busy streets. Cannons overlooked the harbor. Drummers marched through neighborhoods each morning. The occupation changed everyday life. Many soldiers searched for off-duty employment to supplement their income. This placed them in direct competition with local workers already struggling to earn a living. Arguments became common. Insults were exchanged. Trust steadily disappeared. Small confrontations occurred almost daily. A shove in the marketplace. A heated argument near the docks. A drunken fight outside a tavern. Each incident deepened the growing hostility between civilians and soldiers. Then came the evening of March 5, 1770. It began with something remarkably ordinary. A young apprentice argued with a British sentry outside the customs house. Curious onlookers gathered. The crowd slowly grew larger. Snowballs filled with ice were thrown. Sticks struck muskets. Voices shouted from every direction. Additional soldiers rushed to support the lone guard. Within minutes, dozens of frightened soldiers faced an increasingly angry crowd. No one knows exactly who gave the first command. Some witnesses believed someone shouted, "Fire!" Others insisted no order had been given. Confusion overwhelmed discipline. Then, the first musket discharged. Another followed. Then another. Smoke drifted through the cold evening air. When it cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or dying. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American ancestry, who became one of the first men killed during the growing conflict. The event quickly became known as the Boston Massacre. Although only 5 people had died, colonial leaders understood the enormous political significance of the tragedy. Paul Revere created a dramatic engraving showing disciplined British soldiers firing deliberately into an innocent crowd. The image spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Samuel Adams described the shootings as proof that standing armies threatened the liberty of free people. Whether every detail reflected reality mattered less than the emotions the image inspired. The massacre became a symbol. British officials attempted to calm the situation. Captain Thomas Preston and the soldiers involved were arrested and placed on trial. Remarkably, the defense lawyer chosen for the soldiers was John Adams. Though he strongly opposed many British policies, Adams believed every accused person deserved a fair trial. His decision demonstrated something important about the colonial movement. Many Americans still valued British legal traditions even while resisting British political authority. Most of the soldiers were ultimately acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter after evidence showed they had fired into the crowd. The verdict satisfied few people completely, but it temporarily reduced tensions. That same year, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties. Almost all of them disappeared. Almost. One tax remained, the tax on tea. Its financial importance was small. The symbolic importance was enormous. Britain refused to remove it because doing so would imply that Parliament lacked the authority to tax the colonies. The colonists refused to accept it because doing so would surrender the principle for which they had already struggled. Neither side was willing to retreat. Both believed they were defending liberty. Both believed compromise meant weakness. And somewhere between those 2 convictions, The path toward revolution grew steadily shorter. The uneasy peace that followed the Boston Massacre lasted only a few years. The streets of Boston became quieter. Trade slowly recovered. British soldiers withdrew from the city. To many observers, it seemed that the imperial crisis might finally fade away. Yet beneath the calm, neither side had abandoned its convictions. Britain still insisted that Parliament possessed the unquestionable right to govern every corner of the empire. The colonists remained equally determined that no government could tax free people without their consent. Only one parliamentary tax remained: the tax on tea. Financially, it was small. Politically, it represented everything. Then an unexpected problem forced Britain to act. Across the globe, the British East India Company stood on the edge of financial disaster. For decades, it had dominated trade between Britain and Asia. Its ships carried tea, silk, spices, porcelain, and countless luxury goods across the oceans. But years of war, corruption, and poor management had left the company drowning in debt. Warehouses overflowed with millions of pounds of unsold tea. If the company collapsed, the consequences would reach far beyond London. Thousands of jobs would disappear. Government revenues would shrink. Britain's largest trading corporation might simply fail. Parliament believed it had found a clever solution. In 1773, lawmakers passed the Tea Act. The new law actually lowered the final price of tea sold in the American colonies. By allowing the East India Company to sell directly to colonial merchants, expensive middlemen were eliminated. Ironically, tea became cheaper than before. British officials assumed the colonists would gladly purchase inexpensive tea. After all, who would object to paying less? But once again, they misunderstood the real issue. The argument had never centered on price. It centered on principle. Many colonial leaders warned that buying the cheaper tea would quietly acknowledge Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. Even if the tax amounted to only a few pennies, accepting it meant surrendering a principle they believed was essential to liberty. Across the colonies, resistance quickly organized. Ships carrying East India Company tea were turned away from ports. Merchants refused deliveries. Public meetings demanded that tea agents resign. In city after city, pressure from ordinary citizens made distributing the tea nearly impossible. Only Boston became the center of open confrontation. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow 3 tea ships anchored in Boston Harbor to leave without unloading their cargo and paying the required duties. The ships remained trapped. Their captains could neither unload the tea nor legally sail home. For nearly 3 weeks, tension filled the city. Each day, thousands gathered in town meetings to debate what should happen next. On the evening of December 16, 1773, the waiting ended. As darkness settled over Boston Harbor, dozens of men quietly assembled. Many disguised themselves with blankets, face paint, and clothing inspired by Native Americans. The disguises were imperfect. Most people recognized that they were local colonists. The costumes served less to conceal their identities than to symbolize that they no longer considered themselves simply British subjects. Without shouting, without panic, the group marched toward Griffin's Wharf. They boarded the 3 tea ships one by one. Crew members offered almost no resistance. The men worked with remarkable discipline. Using axes and iron bars, they smashed open hundreds of wooden tea chests. One after another, the chests crashed onto the decks. Thousands of pounds of loose tea spilled into the freezing waters below. For nearly 3 hours, they continued their work. By night's end, 342 chests of tea had been destroyed. The cargo was worth nearly 10,000 pounds sterling, an enormous fortune by 18th century standards. Yet something about the event surprised even later historians. Nothing else was stolen. No money disappeared. Private belongings remained untouched. Participants reportedly swept the decks before leaving and even replaced a broken padlock. The target was not private property. The target was Parliament's authority. As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, the water itself had turned dark with floating tea leaves. The news spread rapidly across the Atlantic. Some colonists celebrated the action as a courageous defense of liberty. Others worried that destroying private property had crossed a dangerous line. Even Benjamin Franklin, who strongly opposed British taxation, believed the East India Company should eventually be compensated. In London, however, the reaction was immediate and furious. To many members of Parliament, the destruction of the tea represented not political protest, but outright rebellion. King George III reached a simple conclusion. The die is now cast. The colonies, he believed, must either submit or be compelled by force. Parliament responded with a series of harsh laws in 1774. In Britain, they were officially called the Coercive Acts. In America, they quickly became known as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until every chest of destroyed tea had been paid for. Massachusetts lost much of its right to govern itself. Town meetings were heavily restricted. Royal officials accused of crimes could now be tried outside the colony. Additional British troops arrived to enforce order. To Parliament, these measures were intended as punishment. To many colonists, they looked like tyranny. Something unexpected happened next. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain united the colonies. Food, money, and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, South Carolina, and others offered public support. People who had once viewed Boston's problems as local concerns now saw them as threats to every colony. If Parliament could close one colonial port, what might stop it from closing another? Could the others be next? For the first time, the 13 colonies began thinking not simply as neighbors, but as partners. The conflict had moved beyond taxes, beyond tea, beyond trade. It had become a struggle over power itself. And soon, the Intolerable Acts were designed to isolate Massachusetts. Instead, they awakened something Britain had never intended to create: a sense of unity. For generations, the 13 colonies had lived as separate societies. Each had its own governor, its own legislature, its own economy, its own traditions. Many colonists had never traveled beyond the borders of their own province. Few imagined that one day they would act together. Yet by the summer of 1774, events in Boston convinced many that no colony could stand alone. If Parliament could strip away the rights of Massachusetts, then no colony was truly safe. Across America, local committees exchanged letters almost daily. Messengers rode hundreds of miles carrying news from town to town. Printers worked late into the night producing pamphlets that argued the liberties of all British subjects were under threat. Church bells announced public meetings. Courthouses filled with anxious citizens. For the first time, people from distant colonies began discussing not only local concerns, but a shared future. In September of 1774, 56 delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Their meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. It was unlike anything the colonies had ever attempted. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies entered the city. Only Georgia, still facing conflict on its frontier, chose not to attend. The delegates themselves represented remarkably different personalities. John Adams of Massachusetts arrived determined and uncompromising. His cousin, Samuel Adams, remained one of the most passionate advocates for colonial resistance. Patrick Henry of Virginia possessed extraordinary speaking ability. John Jay represented New York with careful legal reasoning. George Washington attended quietly, wearing his military uniform despite holding no active command. Many delegates noticed him immediately. His calm dignity left a lasting impression. Despite their differences, nearly every delegate agreed on one point. They still hoped to avoid war. Few desired independence. Most continued to consider themselves loyal subjects of King George III. Their quarrel, they believed, was with Parliament's policies, not necessarily with the Crown itself. The debates lasted for weeks. Some argued for stronger resistance. Others urged patience. Compromise remained difficult. Yet gradually a plan emerged. The Congress approved the Continental Association, an agreement calling for a complete boycott of British goods. Merchants promised not to import British products. Consumers pledged not to purchase them. If Britain refused to change its policies, colonial exports would eventually stop as well. Economic pressure, they hoped, might succeed where petitions had failed. The delegates also issued a formal Declaration of Rights. It affirmed their loyalty to the king while insisting that colonial assemblies, not Parliament, held the legitimate authority to tax Americans. Copies spread quickly throughout the colonies. Many ordinary people read them aloud in churches, taverns, and village squares. For countless listeners, these words transformed scattered frustrations into a common cause. Meanwhile, events in Massachusetts continued moving toward confrontation. General Thomas Gage had been appointed military governor of the colony. An experienced British officer, Gage believed order could still be restored. But each passing week made his task more difficult. Outside Boston, local militia companies began training more frequently. These citizen soldiers became known as the Minutemen because they claimed they could assemble at a minute's notice. Farmers practiced marching after working their fields. Blacksmiths repaired old muskets. Villages quietly collected ammunition and gunpowder. Officially, these preparations were defensive. Unofficially, everyone understood that violence was becoming increasingly possible. Networks of communication also improved. Groups called Committees of Correspondence exchanged intelligence across New England. Riders carried warnings about British troop movements. Signal systems appeared in church towers and hilltops. Entire communities became linked by an informal web of information. General Gage watched these developments with growing concern. Reports reached him that large quantities of military supplies had been hidden in the nearby town of Concord. If those weapons remained in colonial hands, they could support open rebellion. In London, officials ordered Gage to act decisively. The military stores, they insisted, must be seized before resistance became impossible to control. The operation required speed and secrecy. On the evening of April 18, 1775, approximately 700 British regulars quietly assembled in Boston. Their mission appeared straightforward. March to Concord. Confiscate the hidden weapons. Return before serious resistance could form. Yet secrecy proved impossible. Patriot observers noticed unusual military activity almost immediately. One silversmith, Paul Revere, prepared for a dangerous ride through the Massachusetts countryside. Joined by William Dawes and later Samuel Prescott, he galloped through the darkness warning village after village. The regulars are coming. Church bells rang through sleeping towns. Dogs barked. Windows opened. Lanterns flickered into the night. Militia captains hurried from house to house. Farmers left their beds. Blacksmiths grabbed muskets. Young apprentices hurried to meeting places. Entire communities awakened before sunrise. Long before British soldiers reached Lexington, the countryside was already waiting. Neither side fully expected what would happen next. Most colonial militiamen hoped that simply standing together might discourage violence. Almost no one imagined that, within a few hours, a single gunshot would echo across a village green and change the course of world history forever. Before sunrise on April 19, 1775, a cool mist settled over the quiet fields of Massachusetts. The roads between Boston, Lexington, and Concord were still dark. Only the sound of boots marching through the countryside disturbed the silence. Nearly 700 British regulars moved steadily westward under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith. Their orders remained clear: reach Concord, destroy the colonial military supplies, return to Boston before resistance could organize. To experienced British officers, the mission appeared routine. The soldiers were among the finest trained infantry in the world. Most expected little more than scattered protests from local farmers. They could not know that nearly every village ahead had already been warned. Throughout the night, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott had ridden from town to town. Church bells rang. Signal guns echoed through the darkness. Messengers knocked on farmhouse doors. Militia captains hurriedly gathered their companies. Men left warm beds, kissed frightened families goodbye, and reached for muskets that had often belonged to their fathers and grandfathers. Many had never fired a weapon in battle. Few imagined they were about to begin a revolution. Just before dawn, the British column entered Lexington. Waiting on the village green stood roughly 77 colonial militia under Captain John Parker. Parker was no professional soldier. He was a farmer, a veteran of the French and Indian War, and a man already weakened by tuberculosis. Understanding how greatly his force was outnumbered, Parker issued a simple order: stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. His men formed a thin line across the common. Their purpose was not to defeat the British Army. It was simply to demonstrate that they would not surrender their rights without being seen. As the British approached, Major John Pitcairn rode forward. Witnesses later recalled him shouting for the militia to disperse. Some colonists began stepping backward. Others hesitated. The tension became unbearable. Then, a single gunshot cracked through the morning air. No one knows with certainty who fired first. Perhaps it came from behind a stone wall. Perhaps from a nervous militiaman. Perhaps from a British soldier startled by the confusion. History has never provided a definite answer. Within seconds, discipline collapsed. British soldiers fired a volley. The militia answered with scattered shots. Smoke covered the village green. When it cleared, 8 colonists lay dead. 10 more were wounded. Only 1 British soldier had been injured. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet those 2 minutes would alter the future of the world. The British continued marching toward Concord. Behind them, news spread faster than the soldiers themselves. Riders galloped across New England. The regulars have fired. The fighting has begun. Church bells rang from one town after another. Farmers abandoned plows in their fields. Mill workers left their workshops. By the time British troops reached Concord later that morning, hundreds of armed militia had already assembled nearby. The soldiers searched the town. They destroyed several cannon carriages, burned wooden gun stocks, spiked a few artillery pieces. But much of the military equipment had already been hidden by local residents. Then another misunderstanding nearly changed everything. Smoke from burning supplies drifted above the town. Watching from nearby hills, many militia believed British troops were setting Concord itself on fire. Determined to protect their homes, several hundred colonial soldiers advanced toward the North Bridge. British troops guarding the crossing prepared to stop them. For a few long moments, both sides stood facing each other across the wooden bridge. Neither wanted to fire first. Yet once again, someone pulled a trigger. This time, the British fired the opening volley. Several militia fell. Then the Americans returned fire together. The disciplined volley struck the British line with deadly accuracy. 3 British soldiers were killed. Several others collapsed wounded. The surprised regulars retreated across the bridge. For the first time in the conflict, British soldiers had been forced to withdraw before colonial militia. Word spread almost instantly. The impossible had happened. Ordinary farmers had driven back professional soldiers of the British Army. Colonial confidence surged. Lieutenant Colonel Smith now understood the danger. His mission had failed. The military supplies were largely gone. Thousands of armed colonists were gathering throughout the countryside. He immediately ordered a retreat toward Boston. But the road home had become far more dangerous than the march west. Militia companies no longer gathered in open fields. Instead, they used the landscape itself. Stone walls, dense forests, rolling hills, farmhouses. Every bend in the road offered another opportunity to strike. British soldiers marched under constant fire. A volley from behind a fence, another from the edge of a wood, then silence, until the next attack. The fighting stretched for nearly 16 exhausting miles. Heat, exhaustion, smoke, and fear slowly broke the discipline of many British units. Ammunition ran low. Water became scarce. Officers struggled to maintain order. Only the timely arrival of nearly 1,000 reinforcements under Lord Hugh Percy prevented complete disaster. By sunset, the cost shocked both sides. Approximately 273 British soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. The colonial militia suffered around 95 casualties. The numbers alone did not explain the significance. For the first time, the British Empire had fought openly against its own American subjects. The dispute over taxes and political representation had become a shooting war. The revolution had begun. No declaration of independence had yet been written. No new nation yet existed. Most colonists still hoped reconciliation might somehow be possible. But after Lexington and Concord, neither side could return to the world that had existed only 24 hours earlier. The first shots of the American Revolution had echoed across quiet Massachusetts villages, and their sound would soon be heard around the entire world. The news from Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies with astonishing speed. Within days, thousands of militia from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire marched toward Boston. Farmers left their fields. Blacksmiths abandoned their forges. Shopkeepers closed their doors. Students left their classrooms. Almost overnight, an untrained but determined army surrounded the city. British General Thomas Gage suddenly found himself trapped. Although British forces still controlled Boston and its harbor, every road leading out of the city was now watched by colonial militia. The siege had begun. Unlike the great European wars of the 18th century, this was not a campaign of grand fortresses or massive armies maneuvering across open fields. Instead, it became a waiting game. The Americans lacked heavy artillery capable of attacking Boston directly. The British controlled the sea but dared not move far into the countryside. For weeks, both sides simply watched one another. Small patrols occasionally exchanged fire. Supplies slowly became more difficult to obtain. Disease spread through crowded military camps. Everyone understood that the conflict had entered an entirely new phase. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, political leaders prepared for another historic meeting. On May 10, 1775, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the Second Continental Congress. Unlike the First Congress, these delegates no longer discussed hypothetical dangers. War had already begun. Gunfire at Lexington, bloodshed at Concord, the siege surrounding Boston. These were now undeniable realities. Among the delegates sat many familiar faces. John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry. Benjamin Franklin had recently returned from London after years of unsuccessful attempts to reconcile Britain and the colonies. His optimism had largely disappeared. He now believed peaceful compromise was becoming impossible. One delegate attracted particular attention. George Washington of Virginia entered the meeting wearing his blue military uniform. He had not requested command. He made no speeches promoting himself. Yet his quiet presence spoke volumes. John Adams understood something many others did not. If the struggle remained dominated by New England leaders, Southern colonies might feel less committed. Choosing a respected Virginian could unite the colonies behind a common military leader. On June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepted with remarkable humility. Standing before the delegates, he admitted that he did not believe himself fully qualified for such an enormous responsibility. He even declined a salary, requesting only reimbursement for his expenses. Those words impressed nearly everyone present. The decision transformed a collection of local militias into something entirely different. For the first time, America possessed a national army. Yet creating that army would prove extraordinarily difficult. The soldiers surrounding Boston came from different colonies. They wore no standard uniform. Many carried different types of muskets requiring different ammunition. Military discipline varied enormously. Some men enlisted for only a few months. Others expected to return home whenever harvest season arrived. Food supplies often ran short. Gunpowder remained dangerously scarce. Washington would soon discover that inspiring courage was far easier than organizing an army. Even as Congress prepared for a long struggle, many delegates still hoped reconciliation remained possible. In July 1775, they sent one final appeal directly to King George III. Known as the Olive Branch Petition, it expressed loyalty to the crown while asking the king to help restore peace between Britain and the colonies. The delegates insisted they desired justice, not independence. But events had already moved beyond compromise. King George refused even to receive the petition. Instead, he declared that the colonies were in open rebellion against lawful authority. To him, the fighting around Boston was not a political disagreement. Across the Atlantic, Parliament authorized the expansion of British military operations. Thousands of additional troops prepared to sail for America. German soldiers, later known collectively as Hessians, were also hired to strengthen British forces. Both sides now expected a much longer conflict than anyone had imagined only months earlier. Yet before the revolution could spread across the continent, another fierce battle would erupt just outside Boston. On a hill overlooking the harbor, thousands of determined colonial soldiers prepared to challenge one of the finest armies in the world. The Battle of Bunker Hill was about to begin. The siege around Boston continued through the early summer of 1775. Each morning, colonial soldiers looked across the fields toward British positions inside the city. Across the harbor, British officers studied the growing network of American camps with increasing concern. Neither side wanted to remain trapped forever. The question was no longer whether another battle would come. It was where and when. The answer arrived in the middle of June. British commanders learned that colonial forces intended to occupy the hills overlooking Boston Harbor. If artillery were placed there, British ships and much of the city itself could be threatened. General Thomas Gage acted quickly. On the evening of June 16, nearly 1,200 colonial soldiers quietly marched onto Breed's Hill, just south of the larger Bunker Hill. Working through the darkness with picks and shovels, they built earthen fortifications by hand. The work was exhausting. Every shovel of dirt was lifted in silence. Every sound risked revealing their position. As dawn broke on June 17th, British sailors looked toward the hills in disbelief. Where only hours earlier there had been open ground, a fortified position now overlooked the harbor. General Gage immediately ordered an assault. Warships opened fire. Cannons thundered across the water. Smoke drifted over the peninsula as British troops prepared to advance. Among the colonial defenders stood men from farms, villages, and small towns across New England. Many had never fought in a formal battle. They lacked polished uniforms. Some carried hunting rifles. Others held aging muskets passed down through generations. Every shot mattered. Colonel William Prescott walked calmly along the defensive line, encouraging his exhausted soldiers. Tradition later credited him with the famous order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Whether those exact words were spoken remains uncertain, but the meaning was clear. Hold your fire. Wait until the enemy is close. Make every bullet count. Shortly after 3 in the afternoon, nearly 2,000 British soldiers began climbing the hillside. Their bright red uniforms stood out against the green grass. Officers marched confidently at the front. Military bands played as disciplined lines advanced uphill. To experienced European commanders, the outcome seemed obvious. Professional soldiers would quickly overwhelm inexperienced militia. The Americans waited. British troops climbed steadily. The distance closed. 100 yards. 75. 50. Then, the colonial line erupted. A devastating volley crashed into the advancing British ranks. Men fell almost instantly. Entire sections of the assault line staggered backward. Officers shouted desperately for their soldiers to reform. The survivors retreated down the hill. British commanders prepared another assault. Again, the red-coated soldiers advanced with remarkable discipline. Again, the Americans remained silent until the last possible moment. Once more, the attack collapsed. The hillside was now covered with smoke, broken equipment, and wounded men calling for help. Twice, disciplined regulars had been driven back by colonial volunteers. But the Americans faced a growing problem. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Powder horns emptied. Musket balls became scarce. Some soldiers searched the ground for spent British ammunition. Others waited with unloaded weapons. General William Howe ordered one final attack. This time, British troops changed their tactics. Instead of advancing in tightly packed formations, they spread out and attacked the weaker colonial flank. Without sufficient ammunition, the Americans could no longer maintain effective fire. As British soldiers reached the earthworks, fierce hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets clashed against musket stocks. Men struggled with clubs, knives, and bare hands. Colonial commanders reluctantly ordered a retreat. The defenders withdrew in surprisingly good order, carrying many of their wounded with them. The British had captured the hill. Technically, it was a British victory, but it came at a terrible price. More than 1,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded. Nearly half of the assault force became casualties. Many experienced officers were among the dead. The colonial army suffered far fewer losses. News of the battle spread rapidly across both sides of the Atlantic. In Britain, Many leaders celebrated the capture of the hill. Yet military professionals recognized the alarming reality. If every American victory cost Britain this much, winning the war would become extraordinarily expensive. For the colonies, Bunker Hill transformed confidence into determination. They had not held the position, but they had proven something even more important. Ordinary citizen soldiers could stand against one of the finest armies on earth. Only weeks later, George Washington arrived outside Boston to assume command of the newly created Continental Army. What he found surprised him. Thousands of enthusiastic volunteers, but almost no real army. Units answered to different officers. Supplies were disorganized. Gunpowder remained dangerously low. Uniforms varied from colony to colony. Military discipline differed from one camp to another. Washington immediately understood that bravery alone would never defeat Britain. The revolution needed more than courage. It needed organization, leadership, discipline, and patience. Standing on a hill overlooking the sprawling camps surrounding Boston, Washington quietly surveyed the men who had placed their hopes in him. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, carpenters, merchants, boys barely old enough to shave, veterans growing gray with age. They spoke with different accents. They came from different colonies. Many had never met before, yet together, they would become the Continental Army. The road ahead promised hardship beyond anything they could yet imagine. Winter, disease, defeat, hunger. Victory still seemed impossibly distant. But after Bunker Hill, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The American Revolution was no longer a local rebellion. It had become a war that would decide the future of an empire. By the summer of 1775, the smoke from Bunker Hill had barely cleared. The hills surrounding Boston remained crowded with thousands of colonial soldiers. Inside the city, British troops waited behind fortified defenses. Neither army seemed capable of delivering a decisive victory. Yet beyond the battlefield, another struggle continued. One fought with letters, petitions, and hope. Despite months of bloodshed, many Americans still could not imagine a future without Britain. For generations they had considered themselves loyal subjects of King George III. They admired the British Constitution. They celebrated British victories. Many still believed the king had simply been misled by Parliament. Surely, if the monarch understood the suffering in America, peace could still be restored. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress made one final attempt at reconciliation. The delegates carefully drafted a respectful message directly to King George III. History remembers it as the Olive Branch Petition. Its language was remarkably humble. The Congress declared its continued loyalty to the Crown. It denied any desire for independence. Instead, the delegates pleaded for the king to intervene personally and protect the constitutional rights of his American subjects. Many hoped this document would prevent a long and devastating war. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania became one of its strongest supporters. Unlike some of the more radical delegates, Dickinson believed that compromise remained possible. He feared that complete separation would unleash years of violence and uncertainty. Others quietly doubted the effort would succeed. John Adams privately questioned whether the king had any intention of negotiating. Benjamin Franklin, having spent years in London defending colonial rights, had already lost much of his faith in British politics. Still, the petition was sent across the Atlantic. Weeks passed, then months. Finally, Britain's answer arrived. It was not the response the delegates had hoped for. King George III refused even to receive the Olive Branch Petition. Before reading its contents, he had already reached his conclusion. On August 23, 1775, he issued the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition. The colonies, he declared, were in a state of open rebellion. Those resisting royal authority were no longer misguided subjects. They were traitors. For many Americans, the proclamation came as a profound shock. The emotional break proved almost as important as the political one. Across the colonies, newspapers published the King's Declaration. It was read aloud in churches, debated in town meetings. Many who had once blamed Parliament alone now began questioning the monarchy itself. At the same time, Britain prepared for a much larger war. Supplies became increasingly difficult to obtain. Trade with Britain nearly collapsed. To strengthen the army, the British government hired thousands of professional German soldiers from several small German states. Americans soon referred to them collectively as Hessians. Their arrival caused widespread alarm. To many colonists, the decision seemed deeply insulting. Instead of seeking peace with fellow British subjects, the Crown had chosen to employ foreign mercenaries against them. Meanwhile, George Washington continued transforming the collection of militia surrounding Boston into a functioning army. Every day presented new challenges. Soldiers lacked shoes. Uniforms remained inconsistent. Food shortages became common. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded camps. Smallpox posed a constant threat. Many enlistments were scheduled to expire within months. Washington understood that if enough soldiers simply returned home, the army might disappear without ever fighting another major battle. Discipline became his highest priority. Camp sanitation improved. Daily drills became routine. Supply officers struggled to organize food, clothing, and ammunition. Progress came slowly, but steadily. Far from Boston, support for the revolutionary cause continued to grow. Local committees of safety replaced royal authority in many communities. Colonial governments increasingly acted without British approval. Ordinary citizens who had once hoped merely to defend traditional rights now found themselves participating in something much larger. A new political order was quietly taking shape. Yet one great question still remained unanswered. If reconciliation was impossible, what exactly were the colonies fighting for? The answer arrived early the following year. In January 1776, an English immigrant named Thomas Paine published a short pamphlet. Its title was simple, Common Sense. Written in clear language that ordinary people could easily understand, the pamphlet challenged an idea that few had dared question openly. Why should an island rule an entire continent? Paine argued that monarchy itself was unnatural. He insisted that America should not merely seek better treatment within the British Empire. It should become a completely independent nation. The pamphlet spread with astonishing speed. Printers worked day and night producing new editions. Copies passed from hand to hand. In taverns, churches, military camps, and private homes, people read its words aloud to friends and neighbors. Within only a few months, Common Sense sold more copies than any publication in colonial history. It changed the conversation forever. The debate was no longer about taxes, or tea, or representation. Now the question was far greater. Could an entirely new nation be born? And if so, who would possess the courage to declare it before the most powerful empire on earth? For nearly a year, fighting had continued around Boston. Families had been divided. Lives had been lost. Trade across the Atlantic had nearly collapsed. Yet many Americans still hesitated to take the final step. They had resisted Parliament. They had fought British soldiers. That was something entirely different. For generations, the British monarchy had represented stability. Many feared that independence would bring only chaos. Who would govern? How would laws be enforced? Could 13 separate colonies truly survive without the protection of the world's greatest empire? Then, on January 10, 1776, a small pamphlet appeared in Philadelphia. Its author was an English immigrant named Thomas Paine. Its title contained only 2 words: common sense. Unlike the speeches delivered in Congress or the legal arguments written by colonial lawyers, Paine wrote in plain language. His audience was not politicians. It was ordinary people, shopkeepers, carpenters, sailors, women reading aloud to their families beside the fireplace. Everyone could understand his message. Why should an island rule an entire continent? To him, the answer was obvious. It should not. He argued that monarchy itself was an outdated institution. No man, simply because of birth, possessed the natural right to rule millions of others. Governments, he insisted, should exist only with the consent of the people. America, separated from Britain by thousands of miles of ocean, had grown into a society capable of governing itself. Remaining part of the British Empire, Paine argued, would only drag the colonies into endless European wars. Independence offered something far greater: the chance to create an entirely new nation. The pamphlet spread with astonishing speed. Printers worked day and night producing new copies. Within only a few months, more than 100,000 copies had circulated throughout the colonies. For a population of roughly 2.5 million people, the impact was extraordinary. People gathered in taverns to hear it read aloud. Militia officers carried copies into military camps. Church ministers discussed its arguments after Sunday services. Even those who could not read heard its ideas repeated by neighbors and family members. Gradually, public opinion began to change. The question was no longer whether Britain had treated the colonies fairly. The question became whether America should remain British at all. Meanwhile, military events strengthened the revolutionary cause. In March 1776, George Washington achieved his first major success as commander. For months, Colonel Henry Knox had organized an extraordinary operation. During the winter, he transported dozens of heavy cannons nearly 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The journey crossed frozen rivers, snow-covered forests, and rugged mountains. Many believed such an undertaking was impossible. Yet Knox succeeded. Once the artillery reached Boston, Washington secretly positioned the cannons atop Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city and its harbor. When British commanders awoke on the morning of March 5th, they were stunned. American cannon now dominated Boston Harbor. Remaining in the city had become dangerously difficult. General William Howe quickly recognized the situation. Rather than risk the destruction of his army, he ordered an evacuation. On March 17, 1776, more than 100 British ships sailed away from Boston carrying thousands of soldiers and loyalist families. After nearly a year of siege, Boston was free. The victory transformed Washington into a national hero. It also proved that the Continental Army could defeat Britain's professional forces through patience, planning, and determination. Yet even this success could not answer the greatest political question. What exactly was America becoming? Throughout the spring of 1776, more colonial governments instructed their delegates to support independence. One after another, Virginia, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Momentum continued to grow. Finally, on June 7th, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee rose before the Continental Congress. His resolution was brief, but its meaning would change history forever. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Debate immediately followed. Some delegates welcomed the proposal. Others urged caution. Declaring independence meant committing treason against the British Crown. If the revolution failed, every man who signed such a document could face execution. Meanwhile, a committee of 5 men was appointed to prepare a formal declaration explaining the reasons for independence. The committee included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and a 33-year-old delegate from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. Quiet by nature but gifted with remarkable skill as a writer, Jefferson accepted the responsibility of drafting one of history's most influential political documents. Inside a rented room in Philadelphia, using books borrowed from friends and ideas shaped by the Enlightenment, he began writing words that would echo across centuries. Words declaring that all people possessed certain natural rights. Words asserting that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed. Words announcing to the world that a new nation was about to be born. The American Revolution had begun with protests over taxes. It had grown through resistance. It had survived its first battles. Now, it stood on the edge of something far greater than rebellion. It stood on the threshold of independence itself. The streets outside the Pennsylvania State House remained busy with merchants, wagons, and ordinary citizens. Inside the assembly chamber, however, a far greater question demanded an answer. Would the colonies remain part of the British Empire, or would they become an independent nation? The responsibility of preparing the formal declaration had fallen primarily upon Thomas Jefferson. Only 33 years old, Jefferson possessed a quiet personality but an extraordinary gift with words. Working in a rented room on Market Street, he wrote for hours each day. His desk held books by Enlightenment philosophers. John Locke's ideas about natural rights strongly influenced his thinking. Yet Jefferson was determined that the document should speak not only to educated scholars, but to ordinary people as well. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams carefully reviewed Jefferson's draft. They suggested changes, removed unnecessary phrases, improved several passages. Congress itself later debated nearly every paragraph. Some delegates wanted stronger language. Others urged greater caution. One controversial section condemned the transatlantic slave trade and criticized King George III for encouraging it. Southern delegates objected fiercely. To preserve unity among the colonies, Congress reluctantly removed those passages. The final document became shorter, but its central message remained unchanged. On July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress voted on Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence. New York's delegates, lacking clear instructions from home, abstained temporarily. John Adams later believed that July 2nd would forever be celebrated as America's true Independence Day. History chose another date. Over the next 2 days, Congress completed its final revisions. Then, on July 4, 1776, the delegates formally approved the Declaration of Independence. With that vote, the United Colonies declared themselves free and independent states. Jefferson's opening paragraphs became some of the most famous words ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas were revolutionary. Governments, Jefferson argued, existed to protect the rights of the people. When governments became destructive of those rights, the people possessed the authority to alter or abolish them. The Declaration then listed numerous grievances against King George III. It accused him of dissolving representative assemblies, maintaining standing armies during peacetime, interfering with colonial justice, taxing the colonies without consent, restricting trade, and waging war against his own subjects. The message was unmistakable. America no longer sought reconciliation. It demanded recognition as an independent nation. News of the Declaration spread rapidly. Printed copies traveled by horseback to towns and villages across the colonies. Public readings became emotional events. Crowds gathered in marketplaces, churchyards, military camps. Many listened in complete silence. Others erupted into cheers as the final words were read aloud. Church bells rang throughout Philadelphia. Bonfires lit the evening sky. Royal symbols were removed from public buildings. In New York City, enthusiastic soldiers and civilians pulled down a large equestrian statue of King George III. The lead from the statue was later melted into thousands of musket balls for the Continental Army. The symbolic transformation could not have been clearer. The image of the king had become ammunition against his own army. Not everyone celebrated. Perhaps 1/3 of the colonial population remained loyal to Britain. These loyalists believed independence was reckless. Many feared economic collapse. Others worried that abandoning the British Constitution would produce disorder and civil war. Families found themselves divided. Brothers disagreed with brothers. Neighbors became political enemies. Some loyalists quietly fled to British-controlled territory. Others stayed, hoping reconciliation might somehow still occur. Across the Atlantic, the Declaration shocked British leaders. King George III dismissed it as the work of rebellious subjects. Parliament refused to recognize American independence. Instead, Britain prepared to send an even larger military force. Thousands of additional soldiers crossed the Atlantic. More warships entered American waters. The struggle had entered a completely new stage. No longer was Britain attempting merely to restore order. It now sought to destroy a revolution before it could survive. For the Continental Congress, the Declaration represented only the beginning. Winning independence on paper meant little unless it could also be won on the battlefield. George Washington understood this better than anyone. His army remained small, poorly equipped, poorly trained. Many enlistments were nearing expiration. Supplies remained dangerously limited. Soon, Britain would launch its greatest military campaign yet. Its target would be New York. There, on the shores of Long Island and Manhattan, the fate of the young American nation would face its greatest test since the first shots at Lexington. The Declaration had given America its voice. Now, it would have to fight for the right to keep it. The Declaration of Independence had given the American Revolution a clear purpose. But words alone could not defeat the British Empire. Its objective was simple: capture New York, destroy George Washington's army, end the rebellion before it could take permanent root. Throughout the summer of 1776, British ships filled New York harbor. The sight was overwhelming. Hundreds of transport vessels, massive warships carrying rows of heavy cannons, thousands of red-coated soldiers arriving almost daily. By the end of August, nearly 32,000 British and German troops had assembled. It was the largest army Britain had ever deployed outside Europe. Standing against them was Washington's Continental Army. On paper, he commanded around 20,000 men. In reality, many lacked proper training. Some carried worn-out muskets. Disease spread through crowded camps. Discipline remained inconsistent. Washington understood the danger immediately. If his army were destroyed, the revolution itself might die with it. New York presented enormous military challenges. The city occupied several islands connected by rivers and narrow waterways. Whoever controlled the surrounding heights controlled the city. Washington divided his forces across Manhattan, Long Island, and nearby defensive positions. Some officers questioned this decision. It spread the army dangerously thin. Yet abandoning any position seemed equally risky. On August 22nd, British forces landed on Long Island without serious opposition. Their movement was carefully planned. Experienced officers studied local roads. Loyalist guides revealed hidden routes through the wooded hills. American commanders expected a direct assault. Instead, the British executed a wide flanking maneuver that struck the colonial defenses from behind. On the morning of August 27th, the Battle of Long Island began. The fighting quickly turned chaotic. American units struggled to coordinate their movements. Dense woods limited visibility. Smoke covered the battlefield. British regulars advanced with practiced discipline while Hessian troops pressed from another direction. Several American regiments fought desperately to delay the enemy. Among them, the Maryland soldiers earned lasting admiration. Repeatedly charging superior British forces, they sacrificed themselves to protect Washington's retreat. Many never returned. Their courage bought precious time. By evening, thousands of American soldiers had withdrawn behind defensive lines at Brooklyn Heights. Yet their situation appeared hopeless. British forces surrounded them on land. The Royal Navy threatened to cut off escape by water. Many British officers believed Washington's entire army would surrender within days. General William Howe chose caution. Rather than launch an immediate assault against the American fortifications, he ordered siege operations. He hoped to force Washington into surrender without unnecessary casualties. That single decision changed history. Washington understood there would be no second chance. If the British fleet blocked the East River, everything would be lost. On the evening of August 29th, he approved one of the boldest military withdrawals ever attempted. As darkness fell, every available boat quietly crossed to Brooklyn. Massachusetts fishermen and experienced sailors guided the operation. Throughout the night, soldiers crossed the river in complete silence. Cannons, horses, supplies, thousands of exhausted men. Everything had to disappear before sunrise. As dawn approached, a thick fog settled over the river. The mist became so dense that British lookouts could barely see the opposite shore. The final American soldiers crossed under its cover. Only after the fog lifted did British troops discover the truth. The Continental Army had vanished. Not a single cannon had been fired during the escape. Washington later admitted that Providence itself seemed to have intervened. Many soldiers believed the mysterious fog had saved the revolution. Although the Americans had lost the Battle of Long Island, their army still existed. The war would continue. The British soon occupied New York City. It became their principal headquarters for the remainder of the conflict. Only weeks later, disaster struck again. A devastating fire swept through large sections of the city. Hundreds of buildings burned to the ground. Both sides blamed each other. The true cause remains uncertain even today. Meanwhile, Washington continued retreating north across Manhattan. British victories followed one after another. At Kip's Bay, many inexperienced American soldiers broke and fled before British advances. Washington rode among them in frustration, desperately trying to restore order. Witnesses later recalled him placing himself within range of enemy fire, furious that panic threatened to destroy the army more effectively than British bullets. Despite repeated setbacks, Washington refused to allow complete collapse. He abandoned New York City. He withdrew through Harlem Heights, White Plains, across New Jersey. Each retreat preserved what mattered most: his army. Many Americans grew discouraged. Some believed independence had been declared too soon. Enlistments expired. Desertions increased. British commanders became increasingly confident that victory was only weeks away. General Howe believed one decisive campaign remained: destroy Washington, capture Philadelphia, end the rebellion before winter. Yet Washington understood something his opponents did not. He did not need to win every battle. He only needed to keep the Continental Army alive. As long as that army survived, so too did the revolution. Winter approached. Morale reached its lowest point. The Continental Army crossed the icy Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Behind them, British forces settled into comfortable winter quarters across New Jersey. Many officers believed the campaign was effectively over. But Washington had already begun planning an operation that would astonish both friend and foe. On a freezing Christmas night, outnumbered and desperately in need of hope, he prepared to gamble everything on one impossible attack. By December of 1776, the American Revolution stood closer to collapse than at any previous moment. Only 6 months had passed since the Declaration of Independence. George Washington's army had retreated hundreds of miles across New York and New Jersey. Each defeat seemed to strengthen British confidence. Each retreat weakened American morale. Soldiers marched through freezing rain with worn-out shoes. Many left bloody footprints in the snow. Blankets were scarce. Food supplies ran dangerously low. Entire companies disappeared as enlistments expired. Some men simply returned home to their families. Others believed the revolution had already failed. By early December, fewer than 5,000 soldiers remained with Washington. Even those who stayed were exhausted. Across the Delaware River, British commanders settled into comfortable winter quarters. Instead of concentrating every soldier in one location, they established a chain of small outposts across New Jersey. One of the most important stood at the town of Trenton. Its defenders were not British regulars. They were approximately 1,400 Hessian soldiers under Colonel Johann Rall. The Hessians were experienced professionals from German states allied with Britain. Highly disciplined, well-trained, respected by both friends and enemies. Many Americans feared them. Stories of their battlefield discipline spread quickly throughout the colonies. Yet winter brought a dangerous sense of confidence. British officers believed Washington no longer possessed the strength to attack. Most expected military operations to pause until spring. Washington saw an opportunity. If he remained inactive, his army would continue shrinking. When the new year arrived, many enlistments would expire. The Continental Army might simply disappear. He needed a victory, not merely for military reasons, but to restore hope. The plan was bold, perhaps impossibly so. On Christmas night, while much of the British Army celebrated the holiday, Washington would secretly cross the ice-filled Delaware River, then march nearly 9 miles through freezing darkness. Before dawn, he would strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The weather itself seemed determined to prevent the operation. A fierce winter storm swept across the region. Rain turned into sleet. Sleet became heavy snow. Powerful winds drove sheets of ice down the river. Many officers questioned whether the crossing should be canceled. Washington refused. As darkness settled on December 25th, soldiers quietly gathered along the riverbank. Large wooden boats waded in the freezing water. Experienced Marblehead fishermen from Massachusetts guided the crossing. The work was painfully slow. Cannons had to be loaded first, then horses, then wagons. Finally, thousands of soldiers climbed aboard. Floating chunks of ice crashed against the boats. Men struggled to keep their balance. Freezing water soaked boots and clothing. The crossing took far longer than expected. Instead of reaching New Jersey before midnight, The last soldiers landed nearly 3 hours behind schedule. Many commanders feared surprise had already been lost. Washington pressed forward anyway. The march toward Trenton became a battle against nature itself. Snow blew directly into the soldiers' faces. Roads turned slippery beneath their feet. Some muskets became too wet to fire. Many men wrapped pieces of cloth around their weapons in desperate attempts to keep powder dry. Several soldiers collapsed from exhaustion before reaching the town. Still, no one turned back. As dawn approached on December 26th, the exhausted Americans reached the outskirts of Trenton. The Hessian soldiers inside the town had heard little warning. Although some reports suggested an attack might be possible, Colonel Rahl believed no army would attempt offensive operations during such terrible weather. He was wrong. Washington divided his force into separate columns. As daylight slowly appeared through the falling snow, the attack began. Cannons thundered through the narrow streets. American infantry advanced rapidly from multiple directions. The surprised Hessians scrambled to form defensive lines. Many had barely left their barracks before musket fire filled the town. Colonel Rahl attempted to rally his men. Riding through the confusion, he organized resistance as quickly as possible. But the Americans had already seized the main roads. Escape became almost impossible. Within less than an hour, the battle was over. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers surrendered. Others were killed or wounded. American losses remained astonishingly light. Only a handful of soldiers died during the operation, most from exposure rather than enemy fire. The victory electrified the colonies. For weeks, newspapers had carried stories of defeat. Now they reported something entirely different. Washington had defeated professional European soldiers. More importantly, he had proven that the Continental Army could still fight. Soldiers whose enlistments were about to expire agreed to remain. New volunteers began arriving. Confidence slowly returned. Even many loyalists admitted that the rebellion was far from finished. The triumph at Trenton was followed only days later by another success. Washington crossed back into New Jersey and marched toward Princeton. There, on January 3, 1777, he once again defeated British forces after fierce fighting. The victories forced British commanders to abandon several positions across New Jersey. Instead of crushing the revolution during the winter, Britain found itself forced onto the defensive. For George Washington, these victories carried lessons far beyond the battlefield. He understood that the Continental Army could not defeat Britain through traditional European warfare. Instead, speed,
surprise,
careful timing, and intelligent leadership would become America's greatest weapons. The darkest winter of the Revolution had ended. Hope had returned. But an even greater challenge was approaching. Far to the north, British generals were preparing an ambitious campaign designed to split the colonies in two. Its success, they believed, would end the revolution forever. Instead, it would produce one of the most decisive turning points in American history. The campaign would lead both armies toward a small village in upstate New York, a place called Saratoga. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had rescued the American Revolution from the edge of disaster. Britain still possessed the world's most powerful navy. Unless something changed dramatically, the war could continue for years. British leaders believed the rebellion drew much of its strength from New England. If they could isolate Massachusetts from the middle and southern colonies, they believed the revolution would slowly collapse. To accomplish this, a bold new campaign was designed for 1777. General John Burgoyne would lead nearly 8,000 British, German, Canadian, and Native American troops south from Canada. His army would move along Lake Champlain and the Hudson River toward Albany, New York. Another British force under Colonel Barry Streetledger would advance east through the Mohawk Valley. Meanwhile, General William Howe was expected to march north from New York City. The three armies would meet at Albany. Together, they would cut the colonies in half. On paper, the strategy appeared brilliant. In reality, poor communication and conflicting priorities would doom the entire plan. General Howe never marched north. Instead, he launched a separate campaign against Philadelphia, hoping to capture the American capital. Without Howe's support, Burgoyne unknowingly advanced deep into hostile territory with no reliable Southern army waiting to meet him. At first, Burgoyne's campaign progressed well. British engineers built bridges across rivers. Roads were carved through dense forests. Heavy artillery followed behind long columns of soldiers. But every mile south became more difficult. American militia cut down trees across roads, destroyed bridges, removed livestock, burned supplies before the British could seize them. The advance slowed to a crawl. Burgoyne's army soon faced another serious problem: food. The long supply line stretching back into Canada became increasingly vulnerable. Fresh provisions grew scarce. To solve the problem, Burgoyne sent nearly 800 German soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum to seize horses and supplies near Bennington in present-day Vermont. The mission ended in disaster. On August 16, 1777, local militia led by General John Stark surrounded Baum's force. After fierce fighting, the Americans overwhelmed the Germans. Hundreds were killed or captured. The British lost desperately needed horses, wagons, and experienced soldiers. Even worse, the defeat encouraged thousands more American militia to join the campaign. Burgoyne continued south despite mounting difficulties. His exhausted army finally encountered the main American force near Saratoga. Waiting for him were Continental soldiers commanded by General Horatio Gates. Among the American officers stood one of the Revolution's most aggressive commanders, Benedict Arnold. At this stage of the war, Arnold was regarded as one of America's finest battlefield leaders. Brave, fearless, sometimes reckless, his courage inspired the soldiers around him. Although personal disagreements with General Gates created tension, Arnold remained determined to stop Burgoyne's advance. The first major engagement occurred on September 19th at Freeman's Farm. British troops attacked through dense forests. Visibility remained poor. Units became separated. Smoke drifted between the trees. The battle turned into a series of brutal close-range firefights. Neither side gained a decisive victory, but Burgoyne's losses were far heavier than he could afford. Nearly 3 weeks later, on October 7th, Burgoyne attempted one final attack. The fighting erupted again at Bemis Heights. Ignoring orders to remain in camp, Benedict Arnold rode directly onto the battlefield. Witnesses later described him galloping through musket fire, shouting encouragement as American troops surged forward. His leadership transformed the battle. The British line began to collapse. American soldiers captured key defensive positions. Burgoyne's exhausted army retreated toward Saratoga. Surrounded, outnumbered, and running dangerously low on food and ammunition,
Burgoyne fait en impossible situation.
On October 17, 1777, he surrendered. More than 5,000 British and German soldiers laid down their weapons. It became the greatest American victory of the war so far. Across the colonies, church bells rang. Celebrations filled towns and villages. An entire British field army had surrendered. Yet the most important consequences unfolded thousands of miles away. In France, for years, French leaders had secretly supplied money, weapons, and gunpowder to the American rebels. But they hesitated to openly enter the war. Supporting a losing rebellion against Britain would have been a dangerous gamble. Saratoga changed everything. The victory convinced King Louis XVI and his advisors that the Americans might actually win. Early in 1778, France officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. More importantly, France entered the war as America's ally. The alliance transformed the Revolution. French money strengthened the struggling Continental Congress. French officers volunteered to serve beside Washington. French weapons continued flowing across the Atlantic. Most significant of all, the powerful French Navy challenged British control of the seas. Britain suddenly faced a global conflict. Instead of concentrating every resource against the American colonies, British forces now had to defend possessions in Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. George Washington understood immediately what Saratoga meant. For Britain, victory suddenly became far more complicated. For America, independence now seemed not merely possible, but achievable. Yet even as hope grew stronger, the Continental Army faced its greatest test of endurance. During the coming winter, Washington would lead his soldiers into a place where hunger, disease, cold, and despair would threaten the Revolution more than any British army. That place was called Valley Forge. As winter settled across Pennsylvania in December 1777, the American Revolution entered one of its darkest chapters. The victory at Saratoga had inspired hope throughout the colonies. France had agreed to become America's ally. Yet George Washington's army remained exhausted, cold, hungry, and dangerously underprepared for another campaign. Rather than pursue the British into Philadelphia, Washington led roughly 12,000 soldiers to a small plateau about 20 miles northwest of the city. The place was called Valley Forge. It offered natural defensive ground overlooking the surrounding countryside. From there, the Continental Army could monitor British movements while avoiding a direct winter battle. On December 19th, the first soldiers arrived. Snow covered the frozen fields. Icy winds swept through the bare trees. There were no permanent buildings large enough to shelter an army. The men would have to build an entire military camp from scratch. Working with axes and saws, they cut thousands of logs from nearby forests. Each regiment constructed rows of small wooden huts. The cabins were simple, rough timber walls, mud packed into the cracks to block the wind, stone fireplaces built by hand. 12 soldiers often shared a single hut no larger than an ordinary bedroom. Construction continued through bitter weather. Many worked with bleeding hands. Others lacked proper gloves altogether. Even after the shelters were completed, daily life remained painfully difficult. Food shortages became constant. Supply wagons often failed to arrive. Poor roads slowed transportation. Local farmers sometimes refused to sell grain, fearing payment in nearly worthless continental currency. On some days, soldiers survived on nothing more than thin flour mixed with water. Meat became a rare luxury. Shoes were in desperately short supply. Numerous soldiers wrapped pieces of cloth around their feet. Others marched barefoot across frozen ground, leaving blood-stained footprints in the snow. Disease spread even faster than hunger. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, influenza. Overcrowded living conditions and poor sanitation allowed illness to move rapidly through the camp. Military hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. Doctors worked with limited medicines and few proper instruments. By spring, nearly 2,000 soldiers had died. Most never faced the enemy in battle. The greatest killer was disease. Yet, despite these hardships, the Continental Army did not collapse. George Washington visited every part of the camp. He spoke with officers, inspected supplies, encouraged exhausted soldiers. Although deeply troubled by the suffering around him, he remained determined to keep the army together until better days arrived. He repeatedly appealed to Congress for food, clothing, and financial support. Relief came slowly, sometimes far too slowly. Still, the army endured. During those difficult months, one remarkable visitor arrived whose influence would shape the future of the revolution.
Hayes Name was Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben,
a former officer in the Prussian army. Von Steuben had served under Frederick the Great, whose military reforms were respected across Europe. Although he spoke almost no English, Benjamin Franklin recognized his experience and encouraged him to assist the American cause. Washington welcomed him immediately. What von Steuben found shocked him. The soldiers possessed courage, but training varied enormously. Different regiments loaded muskets differently. Commands changed from unit to unit. Camp organization lacked consistency. Even basic military drills often differed between neighboring companies. Rather than criticize from a distance, von Steuben chose a practical approach. He selected 100 soldiers as a model company. Every day he personally demonstrated proper marching,
Wapenhandling,
bayonet drills, camp sanitation, formation changes. His colorful personality became legendary. Unable to speak English fluently, he shouted instructions in German and French while interpreters hurried to translate them. When mistakes occurred, his dramatic expressions often amused the soldiers as much as they motivated them. The model company soon taught the next group, then another. Before long, standardized training spread throughout the entire Continental Army. Loading muskets became faster. Battle formations grew more disciplined. Officers learned consistent commands. Even camp cleanliness improved, reducing the spread of disease. Von Steuben also prepared a detailed training manual. Its practical instructions later became the foundation of military education in the United States for generations. Meanwhile, French assistance slowly began arriving. Shipments of muskets, uniforms, gunpowder, medical supplies, money. Although large French armies had not yet landed in America, their support strengthened the struggling revolution in countless unseen ways. Every crate unloaded at an American port represented renewed confidence that the cause of independence would survive. By the time spring returned in 1778, something remarkable had happened at Valley Forge. The starving collection of volunteers who had entered the camp months earlier no longer resembled the same army. They marched together, drilled together, loaded and fired with growing precision. Their confidence had quietly returned. The British had expected winter to destroy Washington's army without another battle. Instead, winter had transformed it. Valley Forge became far more than a place of suffering. It became the birthplace of a professional American fighting force. The trials endured their forged discipline that no amount of battlefield experience alone could have created. Soon, that newly trained army would leave its winter camp. And when it finally met British soldiers again, the world would witness just how much the Continental Army had changed. When the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, British commanders expected to face the same poorly trained force they had driven across New Jersey nearly 2 years earlier. Instead, they encountered an army transformed, disciplined, confident, and ready to prove that the sacrifices of the winter had not been in vain. The opportunity came quickly. After France officially entered the war, Britain recognized that Philadelphia was no longer a secure position. French warships now threatened the Atlantic coast. British leaders decided to abandon the city and concentrate their forces in New York. General Sir Henry Clinton ordered nearly 15,000 soldiers to begin the long march north. George Washington saw his chance. For the first time, he intended to challenge a major British army in open battle. On June 28, 1778, the two armies met near the village of Monmouth in New Jersey. The day became one of the hottest in American history. The temperature climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy wool uniforms trapped unbearable heat. Many soldiers collapsed before firing a single shot. Some died from heat stroke rather than enemy bullets. The battle began in confusion. General Charles Lee, commanding the American advance, ordered an unexpected retreat. His soldiers withdrew in disorder. When Washington rode onto the battlefield and saw the confusion before him, witnesses later described one of the few moments when the usually calm commander openly lost his temper. Galloping through the dust, he confronted Lee directly. Then he immediately reorganized the retreating troops. Fresh defensive lines formed across the fields. Throughout the long afternoon, the newly trained Continental Army stood firm. British attacks repeatedly struck the American position. Each time, the Americans held. Their musket volleys came faster. Their formations remained disciplined. Their artillery answered with growing precision. As evening approached, neither side had achieved a decisive victory. During the night, the British quietly continued their march toward New York. Although tactically inconclusive, Monmouth carried enormous symbolic importance. The Continental Army had fought Britain's professionals on equal terms. The training at Valley Forge had worked. The Revolution had entered a new phase. For the next several years, the war shifted south. British leaders believed stronger Loyalist support existed in Georgia and the Carolinas. By capturing southern ports and rallying Loyalist militias, they hoped to regain momentum. At first, the strategy appeared successful. Savannah fell. Charleston surrendered after a long siege in 1780. Thousands of American soldiers became prisoners. Yet controlling cities proved easier than controlling the countryside. American resistance continued. Small patriot militias attacked British supply lines, destroyed bridges, captured isolated patrols, then disappeared into forests and swamps before larger forces could respond. Rather than seeking one massive battle, Greene adopted a strategy of constant movement. He divided his smaller army, forced British troops to chase him across hundreds of miles. Each victory Britain won came at a growing cost. British General Charles Cornwallis captured towns, but his exhausted army steadily shrank. One important turning point came at Cowpens in January 1781. American General Daniel Morgan arranged his soldiers in carefully planned defensive lines. Militia fired several volleys before withdrawing exactly as instructed. Believing the Americans were fleeing, British troops rushed forward. Instead, they walked directly into disciplined Continental infantry waiting behind the hill. The result was a crushing American victory. Months later, Greene confronted Cornwallis again at Guilford Courthouse. Although the British technically held the battlefield afterward, they suffered losses they could scarcely replace. Cornwallis admitted that another victory like it might destroy his army. Unable to secure lasting control of the Carolinas, he marched north into Virginia. There, he established a defensive base at Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay. It seemed a logical position. The Royal Navy could easily supply him by sea, or so he believed. Far beyond Virginia, events were unfolding that Cornwallis could neither see nor control. A powerful French fleet under Admiral François de Grasse sailed toward the Chesapeake. At nearly the same time, George Washington made one of the boldest strategic decisions of the entire Revolution. Rather than attack British forces in New York, he secretly marched his army south. French troops under General Rochambeau joined the movement. Together, Nearly 17,000 American and French soldiers advanced toward Yorktown. The march remained one of the Revolution's greatest deceptions. British commanders in New York believed Washington still intended to attack them. Only when it was too late did they realize his true destination. Everything now depended upon the sea. In early September 1781, French warships defeated the Royal Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake. For the first time, British control of the coastline disappeared. Cornwallis was trapped.
No escape. No reinforcements. No rescue.
By late September, American and French armies surrounded Yorktown. Siege trenches crept steadily closer each night. Heavy artillery bombarded British defenses without pause. Explosions echoed across the fields. Walls crumbled. Supplies dwindled. British soldiers grew increasingly exhausted. Cornwallis attempted one final escape across the York River. A violent storm scattered the boats before the crossing could be completed. The opportunity vanished. On October 19, 1781, British drums sounded. White flags appeared above the defensive lines. More than 8,000 British soldiers surrendered. Bands reportedly played a melancholy tune as the defeated army marched out. Whether or not later stories captured every detail perfectly, the meaning remained unmistakable. The greatest army in the world had surrendered. Once again, the war was effectively over. Although negotiations continued for nearly 2 more years, Britain gradually accepted the unavoidable truth. The American colonies could no longer be conquered. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. After 8 long years of war, the revolution had succeeded. What had begun with protests over taxes ended with the birth of a new nation whose influence would reshape the modern world for centuries to come. The surrender at Yorktown did not bring immediate peace. Although the fighting had largely ended, thousands of soldiers remained under arms. British forces still occupied New York City. Negotiations would take time. Across the Atlantic, Britain's parliament faced a difficult reality. After nearly 8 years of war, the cost had become overwhelming. The conflict had spread far beyond North America. Britain was also fighting France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic across several continents. Military victories had become increasingly expensive. Public support for continuing the war steadily declined. In London, political leaders began searching for a way to end the conflict with dignity. Peace negotiations opened in Paris during 1782. Representing the United States were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. Each brought different strengths. Franklin's reputation in France earned enormous respect. Adams defended American interests with remarkable determination. Jay insisted that the new nation negotiate as an equal, not as a rebellious colony seeking forgiveness. After months of careful diplomacy, an agreement finally emerged. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed. Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The new nation gained territory stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Fishing rights were protected along the coast of Newfoundland. Both governments agreed to restore peace and encourage the return of property where possible. For millions living in the former colonies, the war was finally over. In November 1783, British troops evacuated New York City. American soldiers marched into the city as British ships disappeared over the horizon. For the first time, every major American city stood free from British occupation. George Washington entered New York not as a conquering ruler, but as the commander of an army whose mission had been accomplished. Soon afterward, he made one of the most extraordinary decisions in modern history. Many victorious generals throughout history had seized political power. Some declared themselves kings. Others became military dictators. Washington chose a different path. On December 23, 1783, he appeared before the Continental Congress in Annapolis, Maryland. Standing quietly before the delegates, he resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He thanked the officers and soldiers who had served beside him. Then, he surrendered his authority to the civilian government. King George III reportedly remarked that if Washington truly returned to private life after winning the war, he will be the greatest man in the world. For a brief time, he hoped never again to enter public life. Yet peace revealed new problems. The 13 states had won independence together, but they remained loosely connected under the Articles of Confederation. The national government possessed very limited authority. It struggled to repay wartime debts. Individual states often pursued their own economic interests. Trade disputes emerged between neighbors. Confidence in the young republic began to weaken. The situation grew especially alarming after Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Farmers in western Massachusetts, burdened by debt and heavy taxes, rose in protest. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, many leaders feared the government lacked the strength to preserve stability. The revolution had secured independence. Now, the nation needed a stronger foundation. In May 1787, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia. Their original goal was to improve the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they created something entirely new, the United States Constitution. Throughout the hot summer months, delegates debated every detail: representation, executive authority, federal powers, individual rights. Compromise followed compromise. Large states negotiated with smaller ones. Northern delegates negotiated with Southern representatives. Slowly, a new system of government emerged, one built upon divided powers, checks and balances, and the belief that no single person should possess unlimited authority. When the Constitution was completed, it required approval from the states. Public debate became intense. Supporters argued that the new government would provide stability. Critics worried it granted too much power. To address those concerns, the promise of a Bill of Rights helped secure final ratification. In 1789, the Constitution officially took effect. There remained one obvious question: who should become the nation's first president? The answer seemed almost inevitable. George Washington was unanimously elected. When he took the oath of office in New York City on April 30, 1789, the long struggle that had begun with protests over taxes had reached its peaceful conclusion. The former commander became the first elected leader of the United States, not through conquest, not through inheritance, but through the confidence of the people. The American Revolution left a legacy far beyond North America. Its ideas inspired reformers across Europe, influenced revolutions in France and Latin America, encouraged new discussions about liberty, representative government, and human rights throughout the world. Millions of enslaved people did not receive the freedom promised in its ideals. Women continued to possess few political rights. Native American nations faced increasing pressure as settlement expanded westward. The Declaration's promise that all people were created equal would challenge future generations to confront those contradictions. History rarely ends with a single victory. Instead, it unfolds through countless choices made afterward. The American Revolution succeeded not because every problem was solved, but because it established principles that future generations would continue striving to fulfill. Tonight, as our journey comes to a close, It is remarkable to remember that everything began with ordinary people asking extraordinary questions. Who should govern? What is liberty worth? And how much sacrifice is required to preserve it? The answers echoed across battlefields, assembly halls, quiet farms, and distant oceans. Long after the cannons fell silent, the ideas born during those difficult years continued traveling far beyond the 13 colonies, shaping nations, inspiring movements, and reminding the world that history is often changed not only by powerful empires, but by determined people who choose to imagine a different future. And with that quiet reflection, the story of the American Revolution gently comes to its end.